Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here in Washington, D.C., commemorating the 70th anniversary of the NATO alliance here at the NATO Engages conference put together by the Atlantic Council, the German Marshall Fund, and the Munich Security Conference. And it's our honor to have with us the 12th Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, General Wes Clark. Sir, it's a pleasure. I remember 20 years ago we were at the 50th anniversary, and there was a whole sub, which I want to ask you about, right? All of us were watching the duck looking relatively tranquil or thrashing a little bit, and there was a lot more thrashing below the surface. Talk to us a little bit about, from your standpoint, what are the challenges the alliance faces right now?
These are probably the most challenging times for NATO. If you look back over its history, during the Cold War, we really had a Soviet Union that was essentially static in Europe. They wanted Europe. They didn't want to give up Hungary or Czechoslovakia, but they were static in Europe. They had weapons. NATO's challenge was to build consensus, match the armaments program, have something in place for deterrence, and then use that to support diplomatic outreach. Basically, we were successful. Then there was a period of questioning of, okay, the Warsaw Pact's gone away, why do we need NATO? Then we got into the Balkans. That was real tough because we required nations to deploy soldiers, and they were afraid. But we got into Bosnia, we never lost a troop in Bosnia. And then we stopped Serb ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. That was really scary for NATO because NATO was actually undertaking a military campaign after diplomacy had failed. They didn't know how it might end. And we did our 50th summit with all this uncertainty in the air. Would it take a ground invasion? But there was a lot of resolve at the summit that NATO would do whatever it took to succeed. Afterwards, there was a lot of blowback from the Europeans. They didn't like what they considered Washington's overwhelming military leadership. They didn't like the secret leadership of TLAMs and stealth, which the Allies didn't have and couldn't participate in. So the Europeans, and then there was 9/11. The Allies wanted to help. The United States said, no, we can handle it by ourselves, but if you want to come individually. So we turned down Article 5. We went into Iraq. The Allies said, this is a mistake. They were right. And then they came in with us later in Afghanistan in 2005. These were all sort of business as usual things from the time of 2003, 2005. That was sort of NATO makes up to the United States. You want us to take this Afghan mission? Okay, we'll take it. We don't necessarily going to do everything you do. There are a lot of national withholds on commitments and things like this. The United States never had a winning strategy for Afghanistan, ever. We never put in the resources. We never linked it with diplomacy. We never brought in the neighbors. It was like, what are we really doing there? And then NATO held together because this was actually peripheral to NATO. But with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the seizure of Crimea, the rejuvenated Russian threat after the invasion of Georgia, but the exercises, the overflights, the threatening statements, and so forth, NATO's back in business. From the Cold War standpoint, the same kind of deterrent mission, only much, much more difficult. Why? Because NATO is in place on Allied soil that used to be part of the Warsaw Pact, in which Russians have deep roots economically and culturally, and to which Russia still claims these are their nations. They want them back. Vladimir Putin wants to restore the Soviet space, the buffer zone, the control, and maybe even more than that. And unlike the Asian leaders of the Soviet Union, Putin's vigorous. He's strategic. He's a risk taker. He's a cautious risk taker, but he's built an expeditionary capability, and where he's not pushed out or blocked, he might come in, as he's doing in Venezuela. So how does the alliance respond to this more subtle, more aggressive, more assertive Russia? This is not the Cold War Soviet Union. This is a much broader challenge to the security of NATO nations.
And so what are the ways that the alliance can deal with two key challenges, right? One, the challenge from Russia, but the other is the concern that the President of the United States has been undermining the alliance cohesion. Everybody understands the need for greater burden sharing. That's been an issue since the foundation of the alliance, but that's not the sole purpose of it. Whatever happened, it was NATO that Article 5 was invoked for our allies to come to the U.S. aid ultimately in Afghanistan. What are the right ways the alliance can deal with both of these challenges? Because folks feel that there are big clouds that are hanging over the future of the alliance.
Well, I wish people didn't feel that way, because NATO is the essential structure that ties together Europe and the United States. It's the only structure. It's like a sausage-making machine in which different national policies come together and then they're merged into something that's coherent and makes sense and that nations commit themselves to. And so it's an essential mechanism that we need. I think nations in Europe, I would just say, you have to look past American politics. It comes and goes. Democracies go in cycles. Nobody should understand that better than European democracies. They do go in cycles, and we're in a cycle. We're in the end of a 40-year cycle in the United States of diminishing the role of government, doubting our institutions, and believing the private sector can solve everything, and measuring everything by money, so forth. This is about the end of the cycle. Is it going to end in 2020 or 2022 or 2024? No, but we're not sure. But what we can feel out there is the restlessness with where we are, and that's where all the energy is on the left in the United States. So NATO allies, don't worry about this. We got solid institutions. You do your part. Let the United States political leaders and would-be challengers, let them do their part. We're committed to Europe.
How do you, in several of your books, you've talked about sort of strategic challenges and how the military piece is only one tiny piece, especially in the modern interconnected world where you're having concurrent cyber operations. Those cyber operations and disinformation operations can spread from one realm to another. The Russians have operationalized a lot of this in their doctrine, the Gerasimov doctrine, and now his new hybrid operations doctrine. How do senior leaders, whether uniformed or civilian, need to think about the security space that we're in? Because everybody has a tendency of going to their kinetic happy place instead of dealing with some of the much, much more complicated issues that you said, for example, should be dealt with by national sovereign wealth funds, for example, as opposed to necessarily putting a TLAM on a target.
Yeah, this is a real challenge. During the Cold War period, the idea was if the so-called balloon goes up, you exercise the NATO General Alert System, condition orange or condition scarlet, and you turn it over to the military commanders. And the only issue the politicians had to make is, do we use nuclear weapons? Other than that, it was a purely military problem, and the diplomacy was ancillary. So over the years, what's happened is NATO is much more a political alliance, but the threat has been transformed. So it's much more subtle. So you have the cyber threat, sure, everybody's aware of that, but you have a business threat of businesses coming in with state funding that will buy strategic infrastructure or attain dominant market positions that will influence NATO nations' national policies. This is the concern with Italy and its new relationship with China. And so NATO has to become much broader. It's got to become much deeper. It's got to be able to handle internal security measures and coordinate among nations for things like Russian fight clubs that we heard about this morning from Senator Murphy. It's got to be able to talk about economic challenges. So it can't be blocked by the European Union. It's got to work hand in glove with the European Union on the economic piece. And it has to be consulted by the European Union, because if you look, for example, at what happened with Ukraine in 2013 with the European offer to affiliate with Europe rather than the Putin's Eurasian Economic Union, whoa, this was a big deal. And it definitely involves NATO. And so, yes, there's a great overlap between NATO and the European Union, but the European Union doesn't consider the security dimension in some of its actions. So I'm calling for greater collaboration between the major institutions that provide the foundations for the West.
Let me ask you last question, which is, talk to us. This has been a very relaxed meeting for you, whereas the 50th anniversary summit was sporty. And you and I were talking a little bit about some of the stuff that most people didn't know that was going on behind the scenes at that summit. I remember I conducted an interview with you, and you seemed very stressed at the point. I wasn't sure whether you were pissed or stressed, and you were recounting to me all of the stuff that was going on.
You have a really good memory, but I think I was just trying not to fall asleep, honestly. I was really tired.
You were, but talk to us a little bit about what that summit was like, because there was a lot of craziness that was going on behind the scenes as we were just, over there trying to waylay national leaders and, bug Robertson and you, Lord Robertson, obviously was NATO Secretary General at the time.
It was Solana at the
So
time.
Javier Solana at the time, that's right. George Robertson was
Came
British
in
Defense
later.
Secretary. That's right. He was still Defense Secretary then. So tell us a little bit about what was going on behind the scenes. On the one hand, everybody's having canapes and meetings, and you guys actually were kind of duking it out behind the scenes a little bit.
Well, what happened was that on the 24th of March, 1999, less than a month before the summit, NATO launched an airstrike campaign of unlimited duration against Serbia, starting with strikes in Kosovo and then escalating. So we went from a few targets to many targets. We went from nighttime only to 24 hours a day. We went from 300 aircraft to 1,000 aircraft. We covered Italy with NATO air bases, and there was no end in sight. And for about the first 3 weeks, or 2 weeks, there was no diplomacy going on. It was just airstrikes. So at the time of the summit, people were really concerned, where's this going to end? People, President Clinton said he had no intention of putting in ground troops, and that's good. But people were asking me, what's going to, are you going to put in ground troops? And I'm saying...
And you were saying, yeah.
I'm saying, well, look, some nations believed before the air campaign started that after Milosevic got the first night of NATO strikes and said, oh, NATO's going to strike. Okay, well, then I surrender. But he didn't surrender. And he hung tough. He believed that Kosovo was more important to Serbia and to him than it would be to NATO. And he listened, I think, to his Russian friends who said, don't worry, we can influence Germany and France, and I'm sure they're going to stop this very quickly. But they didn't. And so as this escalated on up and Milosevic hung tough, the 50th anniversary summit was held at a time of uncertainty, whether we might need a ground campaign, how long the air campaign would go on, and so forth. So there was a lot of concern about that. Nevertheless, it didn't stop the celebrations. But underneath, there's a lot of tension because we didn't want to get out in front of ourselves. So you don't want to threaten a ground invasion unless you know you're going to have to do it. If you want to do it, you want to do it militarily effectively. So, but we didn't do the air campaign we violated every principle of war in the air campaign. We announced it. We didn't use mass. We went in the exact opposite of the way that the U.S. Air Force had done it in the Gulf War in 1991 against Saddam Hussein. It was really confusing for the airmen and for the military. They didn't understand it. This was done for diplomacy. And after 78 days, it worked. But I think, underneath it was pretty painful. I remember the German defense minister just saying, I don't care what the targets are, just bomb and get it over with. And the French general who would come to my chateau every night would say, the Élysée says we must disapprove at least one target each night or we're not doing our job. And the Brits demanded to see all the targets, and the Dutch said, what about us? And the Americans said, no, you're not big enough. And so there were all these tensions in the alliance, plus the questions. Because when NATO uses force and it commits to something like this, then it affects the political stature and maybe the political future of every alliance leader. So it wasn't like Afghanistan, where, okay, you're in it, it's going to go on for a long time, there's another battalion to send, okay, it's not an issue. As long as you don't get a lot of people killed, it's not an issue. This was an issue, and so that was what was underlying the 50th summit.
And one of them is a service chief now, right? Fingers Goldfein got shot down when he was, and he's Air Force Chief of Staff then. Let me ask you this very important question, though. It started with you making the case, even within to folks in the U.S. military, some of your conversations with folks on the Joint Staff about the importance of A, addressing this like a full military campaign, and B, the necessity to put troops on the ground whether anybody liked it or not.
Yeah.
And you and I...
Once you start, you're not going to lose. That's the point. So they asked me in the spring of 1998, what can be done? He's starting another ethnic cleansing campaign. And here we are like 100 miles away in Bosnia, and NATO's congratulating itself. We've stopped ethnic cleansing because we're going to allow the same dictator to restart another campaign 100 miles away. It's going to create another 1 million refugees. Yes or no? And so the NATO answer was no, we're not going to. But then the question was, okay, well, what are we going to do about it? So we basically took the formula that had been worked out in 1995 of airstrikes, and then we followed it by saying, but once you start this, you're not going to stop this thing. It's not going to be like you're going to drop a few bombs and then say, okay, you're going to stop, because he wasn't going to stop. So you had to understand going into it that you were going to succeed. And that was my responsibility as a Supreme Allied Commander.
Let me ask you one last question, because you got very passionate about this when we were talking about it upstairs, that the biggest mistake that NATO and the United States and its allies and partners made was not getting involved in Syria. Talk to us about when that decision should have made and why it was imperative that actually ground forces be committed to that mission.
If you actually look at this, the Syria situation was much like the Balkan situation. What happened when Yugoslavia broke up was refugees started pouring out. They came into Europe. These are people that, like some of these Northern Europeans, are like, who are these people? Where are we? Not worth the bones of a single Pomeranian grenadier. Everybody quoted Bismarck saying that about the Balkans. And yet, it became a big factor in Europe. And so when President Clinton took office, he realized he had to do something more than just let our allies flounder around in the UN protective force. And so we sent Ambassador Chuck Redmond to do negotiations. It didn't quite work. Then there was this terrible massacre that happened after Srebrenica, with 5,000 to 6,000 Muslim men murdered. Then the United States said, that's enough. So NATO is going to punish the Serbs if they do this again, and NATO did. It just so happened we also had a U.S. negotiating team on the ground that I was part of, with Richard Holbrooke as our leader, and we used the bombing campaign to get a ceasefire and break the siege of Sarajevo, and then it followed into the agreement that ended the fighting. Now, that same principle could have been applied in Syria. And people have thought, oh, Syria, that's the Middle East. Well, they found out. All those people are coming to Europe just like the Balkan refugees did. And the Serb air defenses were pretty tough. We lost a guy named Scott O'Grady who got shot down over Bosnia in 1995. And, we could have put a deny flight regime over Syria when that whole civil war started in 2011. We could have done that. We could have put NATO humanitarian missions into Turkey and Jordan. We could have really supported the refugee camps. We could have used that to build an alternative political structure that could challenge Assad for legitimacy in the country. But we did none of that. And we could have put NATO forces in the Mediterranean, so that instead of all these people dying and every nation for itself and Italy bearing all the burden, it would have been borne by NATO allies. And had we done that, we probably would have headed off this huge wave of migration that hit Europe in 2015, 2016, and that has resulted in so much resurgent nationalism in European political circles. And so that was NATO. We had the opportunity, we had the forces, we even had done the play before, but we didn't do it.
Do you think, so what is the lesson? You're a Vietnam veteran. There were other Vietnam veterans at the time. Joe Ralston was a distinguished aviator, for example.
Well, he wasn't, though, in uniform at the time of the Syria.
No, that's true. But what I'm trying to say is that there's this tendency of saying, like, well, because everybody who was in the White House at the time said that President Obama's issue was what next? What happens next? And that nobody could answer that question. What are the clear good lessons to be learned from the Vietnam experience? What are the mistaken lessons, right? I mean, we heard from, I think it was the Greek Defense Secretary, that you shouldn't be a prisoner of history. You've got to learn from it. You've got to use it as a school. From your standpoint, what are the right lessons to learn, and when are there clear instances when you've got to say, hey, the men and women who wear the uniform exist to be able to accomplish a goal, and we have to deploy these people to resolve what could become a much bigger problem now?
Well, I think there's 3 or 4 clear issues. Number one is that you don't go into something unless you can have a plan of success. It may not be a military plan of success, it might be a diplomatic plan of success. That's what we had in Kosovo. We knew what the end state was going to be before the first bomb was dropped, because NATO nations had already agreed. It was just a matter of letting Mr. Milosevic come to face the inevitable loss of the province based on the bad behavior of his government. And so you've got to know what the end state is. You've got to have a political structure that can handle that end state. When we went into Iraq in 2003, there really was no Iraqi political end state. We didn't even get a surrender document from the generals. So there was no real legitimacy for the U.S. force there. After we dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan, we still, held a surrender ceremony on the battleship Missouri because we knew we needed legitimacy with the people. Don't create failed states. So know what the end state is, and then you may have to use diplomacy to get it, and then know what your limits are. And I guess the third thing is that when you go into something like this, you use force only as a last resort. There was a lot of triumphalism in 2003, and a lot of people thought that 9/11 was a good excuse to get rid of Saddam Hussein. That was a mistake. As a result, we didn't get Osama bin Laden when we should have. We made a mess in Afghanistan that still hasn't been resolved, and look at the Middle East today. So we've got to learn from those lessons. NATO is a defensive alliance. It will use military force as a political alliance. It will use military force only, should use force only as a last resort, and only when it understands the end state, unless, of course, there's absolute direct aggression against NATO nations. So there's a lot of lessons that could have been learned. You can't ask the military to solve these policy issues. Military guys won't do it because there's not a one of us that won't tell you there are risks involved when you use military force. And those risks may turn out to be more than you can handle. It turned out that Serbia with 10 million people wasn't capable of standing up to NATO. That was a pretty low-risk exercise if you stood back and looked at it. What happens in Afghanistan, that's not low risk. You've got a nuclear-armed Pakistan that's still feeding the conflict there. And you've got some other neighbors that would enjoy seeing this. So that was never low risk. Neither was Iraq low risk. Not with the size of the force, not with the mission and its capabilities. So the military doesn't want to volunteer to be the nation's solver of diplomatic issues. We aren't, and we shouldn't be. That's the suits, as we say, the politicos. They have to come up with that. We're going to tell you in the military all the risks, all the challenges. And we're going to make sure you know those in advance because we don't want you accusing us of doing something, starting something, or not telling you what the problems might be. And so political leaders have to be able to handle that dynamic. You have to understand the military is going to always hold back on you. I mean, the common perception is generals want war. Generals do not want war. That's the most unpleasant thing that can happen to you as a general. There's no glory in it. There's a heck of a lot of pain and worry and guilt, and you don't want it. So when the politicians might want to shove it off and, well, General so-and-so said it would work. No, general's not going to say that. You tell us what you want, and then we'll tell you if we can do it.
General Wes Clark, retired United States Army, 12th Supreme Allied Commander, Europe. It's always an honor and a pleasure, sir. Thank you.